My name is Greg Johnson, and I've been a police sergeant for over 15 years. I've seen my fair share of crime and chaos, but nothing prepared me for the turmoil that would unfold in my personal life. I was married to Caroline for 17 years. We have 3 children. Marissa, our 16-year-old daughter, who is smart and rebellious. Junior, our 12-year-old son, who is always curious and full of questions. And little Gigi, our 2-year-old bundle of joy who can melt anyone's heart with her giggles. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was at the station, going over some paperwork when my phone buzzed. It was a call from Gigi's daycare. My heart skipped a beat as I answered. "Mr. Johnson, this is Ms. Stevens from Little Angel's Daycare. Gigi has had a fall and hurt her leg. We think she might need stitches." Panic surged through me. Is she okay? Did you call an ambulance? Yes, an ambulance is on its way. We tried to reach Mrs. Johnson, but we couldn't get through. Can you come here as soon as possible? I'm on my way, I replied, grabbing my keys and rushing out the door. My mind was racing. Why couldn't they reach Caroline? She always had her phone on her. As I sped towards the daycare, I called Caroline's cell. It went straight to voicemail. I left a message, trying to keep my voice steady. "Caroline, it's Greg. Gigi's had an accident at daycare. I'm heading there now. Call me back as soon as you get this." I arrived at the daycare in record time, lights flashing. Gigi was sitting on a bench with Miss Stevens, sniffling and holding a lollipop. Her big blue eyes were wet with tears. "Daddy," she cried when she saw me. I scooped her up, inspecting her leg. It was bruised and starting to swell, but she seemed more frightened than anything. "It's okay, sweetheart. Daddy's here," I whispered, kissing her forehead. I turned to Miss Stevens. "Where's the ambulance?" "It should be here any minute," she said, looking worried. A few moments later, the ambulance arrived. The paramedics checked Gigi and decided she needed to go to the emergency room for stitches. I tried calling Caroline again, but still no answer. Frustration gnawed at me. Where could she be? At the hospital, I sat with Gigi while the doctors stitched her up. She was brave, only whimpering a little. I kept my phone on the whole time, waiting for Caroline to call back. Nothing. Once Gigi was patched up, I took her out to the car. As I was strapping her into the car seat, I decided to use the location app on Caroline's phone. She often misplaced it, so we had a tracker installed. When I checked, my heart sank. It showed her at the Holiday Inn, just 7 miles from the hospital. "Come on, Gigi. Let's go find Mommy," I said, trying to keep my voice light. The drive to the Holiday Inn felt like an eternity. My mind was racing with questions and suspicions. When I pulled into the parking lot, I spotted Caroline's car immediately. I parked and, carrying Gigi, headed towards the entrance. As I approached, I saw Caroline and Arthur, her boss, coming out of the lobby. They were arm in arm, laughing and smiling. My heart pounded in my chest. I watched in disbelief as Caroline leaned in and kissed him. It was a kiss that was far too familiar, too intimate. I stood there, frozen, my mind reeling. Gigi squirmed in my arms, breaking the spell. "Daddy, is Mommy here?" she asked innocently. "Yes, sweetheart, she is," I said, my voice tight. "Let's go say hello." As I walked towards them, Caroline's eyes met mine. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of shock and fear. "Greg, what are you doing here?" she stammered, pulling away from Arthur. "I could ask you the same thing," I replied evenly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Gigi had an accident. I've been trying to reach you for hours." Arthur looked uncomfortable, his hand still lingering on Caroline's waist. "I should go," he muttered, stepping back. "Yes, you should," I said, glaring at him. He quickly walked away, leaving Caroline standing there, looking guilty and scared. "Greg, I can explain," she started, but I held up a hand. "Not here." "Not now," I said, my voice hard. "Get in the car. We're going home." The drive home was silent. Caroline tried to talk a few times, but I couldn't bring myself to listen. My mind was a whirlwind of anger, hurt, and betrayal. I glanced at Gigi in the rearview mirror, her innocent face oblivious to the storm brewing between her parents. When we got home, I put Gigi to bed and turned to Caroline. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cold and firm. "But not tonight. Tonight, I need to think." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry, Greg. I'm so sorry." I didn't respond. I couldn't. All I knew was that everything I thought I knew about my life had just been shattered. And this was only the beginning. The image of Caroline and Arthur together at the hotel replayed in my mind like a broken record. I couldn't shake the disbelief, the pain, and the anger that gnawed at me. Seeing them laugh and kiss so openly made me feel like a fool. My wife, the mother of my children, had been living a double life. But right now, my priority was Gigi. I had to push my emotions aside and focus on her. As I settled her into bed, she clung to her stuffed bunny, her tiny hand gripping my fingers tightly. "Daddy, are you mad?" she asked, her big blue eyes looking up at me with concern. "No, sweetheart, I'm not mad," I lied, forcing a smile. "I'm just tired. You need to rest now, okay?" "Okay, Daddy. I love you," she whispered, closing her eyes. "I love you too, Gigi," I replied, kissing her forehead. As she drifted off to sleep, I felt a pang of guilt. She didn't deserve any of this. Once Gigi was asleep, I went downstairs. Caroline was in the kitchen, nervously pacing. When she saw me, she stopped and looked at me with wide eyes. "Greg, please, let me explain," she started, her voice trembling. I held up my hand, stopping her. "Not here. Let's talk in the living room." We moved to the living room, and I sat down, gesturing for her to do the same. She sat across from me, wringing her hands. "How long has this been going on, Caroline?" I asked, my voice cold and controlled. She hesitated, looking down at her hands. "Greg, it's not what you think. Arthur and we just got close because of work. It didn't mean anything." I shook my head, feeling the surge of anger. "Don't lie to me, Caroline. I saw you with him. I saw the way you kissed him." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Greg. It was a mistake. I didn't mean to hurt you." "A mistake," I repeated, my voice rising. "You've been meeting him behind my back. How long has this been going on?" She looked away, silent. I felt my hands clench into fists. "Answer me, Caroline." "A few months," she whispered, barely audible. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath to calm myself. "A few months. Do you have any idea what you've done to our family? To our children?" She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "Greg, I'm so sorry. I love you. I love our family. It was just a moment of weakness." "A moment of weakness that lasted for months," I said bitterly. "I don't even know who you are anymore." We sat in silence for a few moments. My mind was racing, filled with images of Caroline and Arthur together. The lies, the betrayal. I knew I needed more than just her words. I needed proof. "From now on," I said slowly, "we're going to be honest with each other. I need to know everything." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll tell you everything. I promise." I got up and walked to the door. "I need some air. I'm going out for a walk." As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me, clearing my head a bit. I pulled out my phone and called my friend Dave. He was a tech guy and had helped me with surveillance before. "Hey, Greg, what's up?" Dave answered cheerfully. "I need your help," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you set up some surveillance equipment for me? I need to know everything that's going on in my house." Dave's tone turned serious. "Of course, man. What's going on?" "I'll explain later. Can you meet me at my place tomorrow morning?" "Sure thing. Hang in there, Greg." "Thanks, Dave," I said, hanging up. I took a deep breath, looking up at the stars. This was just the beginning. I needed to know the full extent of Caroline's betrayal. I needed to protect my children, and I needed to find a way to move forward, no matter how painful it might be. The next morning, Dave showed up bright and early, carrying a duffel bag full of surveillance equipment. I greeted him at the door, trying to keep my expression neutral. Caroline was in the kitchen, pretending everything was normal, but the tension was thick in the air. "Thanks for coming, Dave," I said, leading him to the living room. "No problem, Greg. Let's get this set up," Dave replied, his face serious. We went through the house, installing small cameras and audio recorders in strategic locations: the living room, the kitchen, and the master bedroom. I placed an extra recorder in Caroline's car. All the while, my mind was racing. This felt surreal, like something out of a bad movie. As we finished, Dave turned to me. "You sure you want to do this, Greg? It's a tough road." "I need to know the truth, Dave. For my kid's sake, and for my own sanity," I replied. He nodded, clapping me on the shoulder. "All right. If you need anything, just call me." "Thanks, Dave. I appreciate it." After Dave left, I tried to go about my day as normally as possible. I took Marissa to her soccer practice, helped Junior with his homework, and played with Gigi in the backyard. But the weight of what I was doing, what I was about to uncover, was always in the back of my mind. At dinner, Caroline was unusually quiet. The kids didn't seem to notice, but I could see the guilt in her eyes. We ate in near silence, the only sounds the clinking of cutlery and the occasional murmur of conversation. That night, after the kids were in bed, I went to my office and started reviewing the footage. It was tedious work, but I was determined. Hours passed as I fast-forwarded through mundane conversations and routine activities. Then, just past midnight, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Caroline was on the phone with Arthur. Her voice was soft, almost tender. "I miss you too," she whispered, glancing towards the bedroom door. "I can't wait to see you again." I felt a surge of anger and hurt, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was just the beginning. I needed more. Over the next few days, I continued to collect evidence. Each new piece was like a dagger to my heart, but it also strengthened my resolve. I started documenting everything: phone calls, meetings, even subtle gestures. The more I saw, the more I realized how deep the betrayal went. One evening, after tucking the kids into bed, I called my old friend Mark. He was a lawyer and had helped me out of a few tight spots in the past. "Mark, it's Greg. I need to talk to you about something serious." "Sure, Greg. What's going on?" he asked, concern in his voice. I took a deep breath. "I think Caroline's been having an affair. I've got some evidence, but I need to know my options." "Come by my office tomorrow," Mark said. "We'll go over everything." The next day, I sat in Mark's office, feeling more exhausted than ever. I handed him a folder with the evidence I had collected. He flipped through it, his expression growing more serious by the second. "This is pretty damning, Greg," he said finally. "You've got a strong case here, but it's going to be a tough battle, especially with the kids involved." "I know," I replied, my voice weary. "But I need to do what's right for them." Mark nodded. "All right. I'll start drafting the necessary documents. In the meantime, keep collecting evidence. The more we have, the better." I left Mark's office feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. I had taken the first step towards confronting the truth, but the road ahead was still long and uncertain. Back at home, I continued to play the role of the dutiful father, all the while keeping a close eye on Caroline. The kids seemed to sense the tension but didn't ask too many questions. I did my best to shield them from the worst of it, but it wasn't easy. One evening, as I was tucking Junior into bed, he looked up at me with those big, curious eyes of his. "Dad, is everything okay? You and Mom seem different." I forced a smile. "Everything's fine, buddy. Just some grown-up stuff we're working through." Okay, he said, but I could tell he didn't quite believe me. I love you, Dad. I love you too, Junior, I replied, ruffling his hair. Now get some sleep. As I closed his door, I felt a pang of guilt. They deserved better than this. They deserved the truth, and I was determined to give it to them, no matter what it took. The surveillance footage and recordings painted a grim picture of Caroline's betrayal. Each evening after the kids were asleep, I reviewed the day's recordings, dreading what I might find. The phone calls, the secret meetings, and the affectionate words all pointed to a deep, ongoing affair with Arthur. One night, as I sifted through the footage, I came across a conversation that confirmed my worst fears. "I can't believe Greg hasn't figured it out yet." Caroline's voice came through the speakers, sounding almost gleeful. Arthur chuckled. "You're good at keeping secrets, Caroline. But we need to be careful." Hearing their voices, so casual and unguarded, made my blood boil. I felt a surge of anger and betrayal that I struggled to keep in check. But I knew I needed more than just evidence of the affair. I needed to confirm my suspicions about the children. The next morning, while the kids were at school, I took the DNA swab kits and collected samples from their toothbrushes. It felt invasive and wrong, but I had to know the truth. I carefully labeled each sample and sent them off to a lab, knowing the results could change everything. Days passed in a tense blur. I went through the motions of daily life, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy for the kids. But inside, I was a mess. The weight of what I might discover was almost too much to bear. Finally, the results came back. I opened the envelope with trembling hands and read the report. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Marissa, Jr., and Gigi were not my biological children. The betrayal cut deeper than I had ever imagined. That evening, I confronted Caroline. I waited until the kids were in bed, then called her into the living room. She walked in, looking wary. "Greg, what's this about?" she asked, her voice tense. I held up the DNA results. "I had the kids tested, Caroline. They're not mine." Her face went pale. "What? That's ridiculous. How could you even think?" "Don't lie to me," I shouted, the anger I had been holding back finally erupting. "I have proof, Caroline. Marissa, Jr., and Gigi are not my children. You've been lying to me for years." Tears filled her eyes as she shook her head. "Greg, please, it's not what you think. I can explain." "Explain?" I scoffed. "Explain how you've been unfaithful to me for years. Explain how you've let me believe these children were mine." Caroline's face contorted with anger and desperation. "I made mistakes, Greg, but I love you. I love our family." I shook my head, feeling the weight of her words like a physical blow. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have lied to me, to our children. You've destroyed everything." She collapsed onto the couch, sobbing. "I was scared, Greg. I didn't know what to do. Arthur, he threatened me. He said he'd ruin us if I told you." "Arthur," I spat. "So he's the father?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, he's the father of all three." I felt a sickening twist in my gut. The man I had seen with my wife, the man she had betrayed me with, was the father of my children. The betrayal was complete. "You need to leave," I said, my voice cold and final. "Pack your things and go. I can't do this anymore." Caroline looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. "Greg, please, don't do this. Think of the children." "I am thinking of them," I replied. "They deserve better than this. They deserve the truth. And so do I." She sobbed, but I turned away, unable to look at her any longer. The woman I had loved, the mother of my children, was gone. In her place was a stranger who had shattered my life. As Caroline packed her bags and left the house, I sat alone in the living room, the silence pressing in on me. The truth was out, but the pain was just beginning. I had to find a way to pick up the pieces, for myself and for the children who, despite everything, were still my family. The morning after Caroline left, I felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness in the house. The kids were at school, and I had taken the day off work to deal with the fallout. My first stop was Mark's office. He had been my lawyer for years, and I trusted him to guide me through this nightmare. "Greg, come in," Mark said, standing up from behind his desk as I entered. "I heard your message. This sounds serious." "It's worse than you can imagine," I replied, handing him the folder with the DNA test results and the surveillance recordings. He sat down and opened the folder, his brow furrowing as he read. "Jesus, Greg, this is a mess." "Tell me about it," I said, sinking into the chair opposite him. "I need to know what my options are." Mark nodded. "First things first, we need to file for divorce. Given the evidence you have, we can argue for adultery and fraud. That will help your case significantly. I also want a restraining order," I added. "I don't want her anywhere near me or the kids." "We can do that," Mark agreed. "We'll need to present the evidence to the court to justify the restraining order. It shouldn't be a problem given what you've shown me." "And custody?" I asked, my voice tight with worry. "I can't let her take the kids." Mark sighed. "Custody battles are always tough, but with the evidence of her affair and the paternity issues, we have a strong case. We'll argue that staying with you is in the best interest of the children." I nodded, feeling a little more hopeful. "Thanks, Mark. I appreciate this." "We'll get through this, Greg," he said, patting my shoulder. "I'll start drafting the paperwork. I'll need you to come back tomorrow to sign everything." The next day, I returned to Mark's office and signed the divorce papers and the request for a restraining order. As I did, a sense of finality settled over me. There was no turning back now. A few days later, a process server delivered the divorce papers to Caroline. I was at home when she arrived, her face flushed with anger and tears. "How could you do this to me, Greg?" she shouted, waving the papers in my face. "You're tearing this family apart." "I'm not the one who did that, Caroline," I replied coldly. "You did when you betrayed me and lied about the kids." "Please, Greg," she pleaded, her tone shifting to desperation. "Think about the children. They need their mother. They need stability and honesty," I said firmly. "And that's something you can't provide right now." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. "I'll fight you on this. I'll get the best lawyer I can find." "Do what you need to do," I said, my voice steady. "But know this, I'm fighting for what's best for the kids, and that's not you." As Caroline stormed out, I felt a pang of sadness. Despite everything, part of me still cared for her, but I knew I had to stay strong for the kids. The following weeks were a blur of legal meetings and court dates. Mark was a rock, guiding me through the process with a calm, steady hand. We gathered more evidence, built our case, and prepared for the custody battle. One evening, as I sat in the living room, Marissa walked in and sat down next to me. "Dad, what's going to happen to us?" she asked quietly. I put my arm around her, pulling her close. "I'm doing everything I can to make sure we stay together," I said. "It's going to be tough, but we'll get through this. I promise." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I miss Mom, but I understand why you had to do this." "I know, sweetheart," I said, my heart aching for her. "I miss her too, but sometimes doing the right thing is the hardest thing." Junior and Gigi joined us, sensing the weight of the moment. We sat together, a family in turmoil but united in our love for each other. As the court date approached, the tension grew. Caroline hired a high-powered lawyer and fought hard, but the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings, the DNA tests, and the testimonies all pointed to her unfitness as a parent. Finally, the day arrived. We stood before the judge, laying out our case. Caroline's lawyer tried to paint me as vindictive and controlling, but the truth was clear. The judge looked at us, her expression stern but compassionate. "I've reviewed the evidence, and it's clear that Mrs. Johnson's actions have significantly harmed this family. Custody of the children is awarded to Mr. Johnson, with supervised visitation for Mrs. Johnson. Caroline broke down in tears, but I felt a sense of relief. The battle was far from over, but we had won the first major victory. As we left the courthouse, Mark clapped me on the back. "You did good, Greg. This is the right outcome for the kids." "Thanks, Mark," I said, feeling the weight lift slightly from my shoulders. "I couldn't have done it without you." We headed home, ready to start the next chapter of our lives. It wouldn't be easy, but we were stronger than the betrayal that tried to break us. Together, we would rebuild and find a way forward. The weeks following the court decision were some of the hardest we had ever faced as a family. The children, who had always been perceptive, began to notice the changes in our household. The tension was palpable, and their questions grew more persistent. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, Marissa looked up from her plate, her eyes full of concern. "Dad, why isn't Mom here anymore?" she asked softly. I put down my fork, feeling the weight of her question. "Your mom and I are going through some difficult times right now," I began, choosing my words carefully. "We're trying to figure out what's best for all of us." Junior, ever the curious one, leaned forward. "Is it because of that man we saw her with?" His question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. I took a deep breath, deciding it was time for some honesty. "Yes, Junior, your mom made some choices that hurt our family. But we're going to get through this together." Marissa's eyes welled up with tears. "But I miss her, Dad. Why can't things go back to the way they were?" I reached out and held her hand. "I know you do, sweetheart. And I miss her too. But sometimes people make mistakes that change everything. What matters now is that we stick together and support each other." Gigi, too young to fully understand, sensed the sadness in the room and climbed onto my lap. "Daddy, are we gonna be okay?" she asked, her voice small and worried. "We're going to be just fine, Gigi," I assured her, kissing the top of her head. "I promise." The next few days were a blur of trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. The kids went to school, I went to work, and we all tried to adjust to our new reality. My colleagues at the station were incredibly supportive, often covering shifts for me or just lending an ear when I needed to vent. One afternoon, as I sat in my office, my partner, Lisa, knocked on the door. "Hey, Greg, got a minute?" "Sure, come on in," I replied, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. She sat down, her expression serious. "How are you holding up?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "It's been rough, Lisa. The kids are struggling, and I'm just trying to keep it together for them." She nodded, her eyes filled with empathy. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. We're all here for you, you know that." "Thanks, Lisa. That means a lot," I said, grateful for her support. Back at home, the strain on our family dynamics became more apparent. Marissa started acting out, skipping school, and arguing with me over every little thing. Junior became withdrawn, spending most of his time in his room. Gigi, though too young to understand the details, clung to me constantly, afraid to let me out of her sight. One evening, as I was helping Junior with his homework, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Caroline standing there, looking worn and tearful. "Greg, please, can we talk?" she asked, her voice trembling. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. "What do you want, Caroline?" "I want to make things right," she said, her eyes pleading. "I know I messed up, but I want to be a part of the kids' lives. They need their mother. They need stability and honesty, Caroline. Can you provide that?" I asked, my voice cold. "I can try," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Greg, give me a chance." I shook my head, feeling a pang of sadness. "I can't trust you, Caroline. Not after everything that's happened. The kids come first, and right now, that means keeping things as stable as possible." She sobbed, but I remained resolute. "I'm not saying you can't see them, but it has to be on my terms. Supervised visits for now. If you can prove that you're serious about changing, we'll talk about more. Thank you, Greg, she whispered, wiping her tears. I won't let you down. As she walked away, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. I wanted to believe she could change, but the betrayal was too deep. My priority was my children, and I had to stay strong for them. The next day, I explained the situation to Marissa and Junior. They listened quietly, their faces reflecting the turmoil they felt inside. Mom's going to have supervised visits for now, I told them. She wants to be a part of your lives, but we need to take things one step at a time. Marissa looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. Do you think she can change, Dad? I hope so, sweetheart, I said, pulling her into a hug. But we need to protect ourselves too. We'll get through this together, I promise. As the weeks passed, we settled into a new routine. Caroline began attending therapy and working on rebuilding her relationship with the kids. It was a slow and painful process, but we were making progress. Through it all, my friends and colleagues continued to support me, offering a listening ear and a shoulder to lean on. It wasn't easy, but with their help, I found the strength to keep moving forward. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: we were a family, and we would face whatever came our way together. The final confrontation with Caroline was inevitable. Despite her attempts at redemption, there were too many unanswered questions, too many wounds that hadn't healed. One evening, after another tense visit, I asked her to stay for a while after the kids went to bed. We sat in the living room, the silence heavy between us. Caroline looked at me, her eyes tired and red-rimmed. Greg, I know I've made mistakes, but I'm trying to make things right. Doesn't that count for something? It does, I admitted, leaning forward. But we need to talk about everything. No more secrets, no more lies. I need to know the truth, Caroline. She nodded, wiping her eyes. Okay, ask me anything. Why, Caroline? Why did you betray our family? My voice was softer than I expected, tinged with the pain of betrayal. It started with Arthur, she began, her voice shaking. He was charming and attentive in a way that you hadn't been for a long time. I was lonely, Greg. I felt like you were always working, always busy with the kids, and I felt invisible. I was working to provide for our family, Caroline, I said, struggling to keep my anger in check. I never imagined you felt that way. Why didn't you talk to me? I tried, she whispered, but you were always so focused on everything else. And once things started with Arthur, I didn't know how to stop. It spiraled out of control. And the kids? I asked, my voice breaking. How could you let me believe they were mine? Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. I was scared, Greg. I didn't want to lose you, and I didn't want the kids to grow up without a father. I thought if I kept it a secret, we could still be a family. But we can't, I said firmly. We'll never be the same. The trust is gone. I know, she sobbed, and I'm so sorry. I wish I could take it all back. The finality of our conversation hung in the air. There was no going back, no undoing the damage. But there was a strange sense of closure in finally confronting the truth. The first court hearing for the divorce and custody battle was nerve-wracking. We sat on opposite sides of the courtroom, our lawyers presenting our cases. Mark had prepared meticulously, presenting the evidence of Caroline's infidelity and the DNA tests. Caroline's lawyer tried to paint a picture of a repentant woman who deserved a second chance, but the judge saw through it. The evidence was too damning. Based on the evidence presented, the judge said, her voice firm, custody of the children is awarded to Mr. Johnson, with supervised visitation rights for Mrs. Johnson. The divorce is granted on the grounds of adultery and fraud. As the gavel came down, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. The marriage was officially over, but the fight for my children had just begun. Outside the courthouse, Caroline approached me. Greg, I know I've lost a lot, but I want to be a good mother to our children. I'll do whatever it takes. I hope you mean that, I replied, looking her in the eyes. Because they deserve nothing less. The weeks that followed were a turning point for me. I started to see a light at the end of the tunnel as I focused on my children and rebuilding our lives. My friends and colleagues continued to support me, and slowly I began to heal. One Saturday afternoon, I gathered the kids in the living room. I know things have been tough. I began, looking at their faces, so full of hope and resilience. But we're going to get through this together. I have some plans for our future, and I want you to be a part of it. Marissa, always the leader, spoke up. What kind of plans, Dad? I've been thinking about moving to a new house, somewhere with more space and a fresh start for all of us, I said. A place where we can build new memories and move forward. Junior's eyes lit up. Can we have a big backyard? And maybe a treehouse? Absolutely, I said, smiling. We can make it our own little paradise. Gigi clapped her hands. And can I have a pink room, Daddy? Of course, sweetheart, I said, pulling her onto my lap. Anything you want. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it felt hopeful. We were a family, and we had each other. That was enough. As we began planning our new life, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The past would always be a part of us, but it didn't have to define us. We could heal, we could grow, and we could find happiness again. And with that, we took the first steps towards our new beginning.